Thank you for joining Office of Women's Policy for our third and final Soup Salad Suffrage panel. We'll begin momentarily. We're letting people in from the waiting room. My name is Pratima. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us for the final Soup Salad Suffrage panel hosted by the Office of Women's Policy and the Women's Equality Leadership Council. We're part of the Division of Equity and Social Justice. We are streaming live on Facebook. This is a webinar format. I welcome everybody. Please have patience as we let our attendees in. I'm going to begin by thanking everyone for joining us. Today we are on day 4 of Welcoming Week, which is commemorated throughout the United States to celebrate and honor the legacy of immigrants who build our country. We're also today very honored to have our final panel for Soup Salad Suffrage on Constitution Day. The 19th Amendment was a momentous occasion that offered a voting bloc opportunity, probably one of the largest voting blocs in the history of this country. And today, as we wrap up our mobilization panel, I want everybody who's joining us to remember that we together have a collective strength that we can bring to preserve, protect, and promote our democracy. I'm honored to introduce our facilitator. We're going to do this really quick because we want to get to the meat of what we want to discuss. Elisa is an award-winning author of a wonderful book. I think of Fannie Lou Hamer, a wonderful suffragist who said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Well, if you're sick and tired, pick up the Roadmap for Revolutionaries written by Elisa, because there are concrete ways in which we can energize ourselves to get back into the community. Elisa also has a blog and a podcast, so look Elisa up. Our panelists today, I have goosebumps because in front of us is this amazing and powerful group of people who I have been honored to work with closely. I want to begin by introducing Desiree Victor, who is the Regional Executive Director of Young Women's Freedom Center. It's an award-winning program that works on diversion for justice-impacted girls and gender-expansive youth. I'm honored to have worked closely with Desiree for the last 2 years to bring the programming for Young Women's Freedom Center to the County of Santa Clara. Along with Desiree, we have Dr. Connie Wan. Dr. Connie Wan has been single-handedly raising the voice of gender-based violence in Asian Pacific Islander communities. As a former litigator representing survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, it gives me great honor that we're going to learn from Dr. Wan, who has spent her time developing narratives and challenges and barriers and solutions for Asian Pacific Islander communities. And last but not the least, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce my recently welcomed co-worker, Senior Management Analyst at the Office of LGBT Affairs, Sarah Fernando. She's also the Chief Diversity Officer of Silicon Valley Pride, as well a council member on the Women's Equality Leadership Council. I'm going to turn it over to you, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Pratima. And welcome, Desiree, Dr. Connie Wan, and Sarah. It is so nice to be here with you. I want to give everyone a heads up that Desiree has a really important meeting to help further the mission of her organization and needs to drop off a little before the rest of us do. So if you notice that early on, we're making sure to get as much from Desiree, to soak up as much of her knowledge and inspiration as possible. That is why. And when you see her sort of quietly leave, we're going to keep going and we're going to keep discussing. So as Pratima said, you can read the extensive and impressive bios of all 3 of these wonderful panelists. And I want to dig right into the conversation, but also give you a chance to talk a little bit at length about how you got to where you are today as someone who is mobilizing for and with communities. And so Desiree, I'm going to start with you, and I would love to know from each of you, starting with Desiree, what is the mission that you're pursuing, and how important has your personal lived experience been in helping you choose this path to work on this mission and try to make a difference on the issues you fight for?
Thank you, Lisa. And well, for me specifically, growing up in San Jose, from a first generation Mexican American and Chicano family, we moved fluidly from extreme poverty into working class and back again. I know specifically growing up and moving quite often, I attended 22 different schools by the age of 14. So I've personally experienced systemic barriers in institutions of academia, being a school push out with a 7th grade academic educational level and 2 children by the age of 17. I've experienced the systemic barriers in institutions of academia, the welfare system, and the criminal justice system. More so, how they've specifically contributed to a narrative that I internalized growing up. This narrative of negative stigmas and the notions of individuality that completely negated systemic accountability greatly impacted my behavior growing up based on the limited options I had as a youth, right? Um, I know firsthand how things could have been different if we would have had access to resources away from the system. This is what has brought me to my work of addressing systemic accountability for the harm it does and to seek critical alternatives outside of the oppressive structures like the criminal justice system.
So what specifically does your organization do to work on these issues?
So at the Young Women's Freedom Center, we work to combat the criminal justice system, and we're currently working on our campaign to decriminalize women across the state with our Freedom 2030 campaign.
Great. And the primary goal of that campaign
Would be to decriminalize women, girls, transgender, non-conforming youth, and women across the state of California.
So does that mean decriminalize, meaning decarceration of currently incarcerated and finding other restorative justice pathways instead of incarceration by
Yes.
that time?
So decarceration and finding alternatives and addressing the human rights that comes along with the gender-based violence. If we look at the panelists on here, all the issues that we are all fighting for all intersect at the criminal justice system, right? If we look at the hypercriminalization of gender-based violence and what's considered a gender norm and what it is to deviate outside of that, it's all hypercriminalized, and the criminal justice system is the intersect of all of this.
Great. Thank you so much. Connie, do you want to, you next. So how is your lived experience brought you to what you do today, and a little bit about what you do, what are your goals, and what is your organization up to? You're on mute still.
Thanks. Thanks for allowing me not to talk to just myself. So hi, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's put this together. I'm so honored to be a part of this, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone here. And I'm excited to see that there are all these participants. So hello to the folks watching us today. A little bit about me is I am first generation born here in the United States in Oakland, California. My family are Vietnamese War refugees. And what that meant is I carry with me an entire legacy of what we like to think of as anti-Asian violence and a history of resistance against colonization. That's kind of in my DNA. And I say that because one of the things that AAPI Women Lead does is we try to expand what the definition of violence means. We try to expand what the definition of resistance means. So we think of colonization as a form of violence. right? So as Vietnamese people, there have been hundreds and hundreds of years of colonization against our communities. And that hasn't been a part of the United States history or part of the history that we have typically owned here in the United States. So we think of violence as colonial wars. We also think of violence in terms of institutional violence, right? So my personal experience is I grew up pretty broke and poor. You know, our family was on welfare, food stamps, and, you know, I barely made it through school. What that means is I typically tell people, you know, that I had about 180 cuts in a school year. No one monitored. No one kind of came after to figure out what that was. And I think about that in terms of anti-Asian violence, because the misnomer is that nothing is happening with the Asians, right? That we just kind of slip under the curve. Meanwhile, there was a lot of violence happening in the household. So the institutional violence in that sense to me is about schools, their neglect and their inabilities to look at the wholeness of their students. So I'm a survivor of that kind of institutional violence, right? I think through about my interpersonal violence, which is that my household had so much violence going on in the home, and that is a personal experience of mine. AAPI Women Lead, looks at gender-based violence at the local, like familial level, interpersonal level, but we also know it's a part of the institutions and the structures of violence. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, I said like all kinds of things at once to tell you my personal experience and what AAPI Women Lead does. We tackle all forms of violence that I've been a survivor of.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that most people don't, when we talk a lot about institutionalized racism, systemic racism, oppression, in this country, we focus a lot, rightfully so, on Black and Brown communities. I don't know if everyone knows that the first immigration act that started to restrict people was to restrict Asians, that we had the internment camps during World War II. Like there's been a lot of very, very explicit, overt, systemic racism targeted right at the Asian community for 100 years. So I think thank you for bringing that out, that does go under the radar. I completely agree with you. I'm just wondering, Sarah, are you also first generation? Because Desiree is. Are you first generation, Desiree? Did you say that? Connie is, I am. Are you also first generation?
I am first generation.
Wow.
So my parents immigrated from the Philippines before I was born. So yeah.
Oh, so I think that's awesome that all of us represent, the first generation, and what this country is built on is all of our parents coming here. So Sarah, let's take it to you just to get that basic table setting of your personal lived experience, how it brought you to where you are mobilizing today, and what your main work is about in mobilizing.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me today. And I always love sharing my story. Every time I get started off, and lovely introduction from Protima. So thank you, Protima. Love that introduction. But I always like to say and start off with every conversation that I just identify as a proud queer transgender woman of Filipino descent. Like I said, I'm first generation immigrant. So my parents came to the United States. My dad was in the military, and my mom came along with him. And when I think about my personal lived experience, it really reflects on my own intersectionality. And every year, every time I reflect upon it, there's something new in terms of what I'm learning about myself. And just thinking about their lived experience and coming to the United States, their means of survival was really to have that colonized mindset in terms of being able to just fit in, assimilate to American culture, and exist. And me coming out as a trans woman around 7 years ago, a lot of my lived experience is really based on my means of survival. So as you can see, that there's a lot of subversive kind of like thought in terms of living as a trans woman, because they came across finding community within the military, within the folks that they brought over, within relatives, even within religion. So I still identify as Catholic, and that's something where it's very different in terms of just like, yeah, I identify as Catholic, but at the same time, does the Catholic community really embrace and empower trans folks within the communities. So it's very interesting when we talk about first generation. My mission overall in life is really to empower and uplift queer, trans, intersectional identities. And that's it, to look at the marginalized folks within across all identities and see what we could do to empower, embrace, and really put folks in a position to succeed, because I feel that diversity in any organization or community is what keeps folks safe. I feel the need for authenticity and hearing authentic voices is what's needed to improve and uplift communities. So I came out as queer and trans around 7 years ago, and I found a lot of identity with the organizations that I worked with before. So with Microsoft, I was very involved with their employee resource group, their LGBTQ employee resource group. And that empowered me to also look at ways I can empower the community here locally. And lo and behold, Silicon Valley Pride was one of my first footings into activism and advocacy here within the South Bay.
So you actually, but you took it a step further and you left the tech world to go into policy and trying to work from within the government, right? Because you work for the county now, correct?
Correct. And the reason why I wanted to be part of county, and this is something that I've been dealing with in terms of where I found myself. So I just found myself, my life's work and just thinking about what I want to do in terms of my life goal. I just felt like coming out as trans and allowing and finding the difficulty with living in my own authenticity and finding strength within that and identity. That's where I gravitated towards in terms of finding ways where if I could live authentically within the privilege that I have within myself, how is it that trans women to this day and the entire trans community is still stigmatized, is still victimized, is still brutalized in 2020? This is something that is not just an issue with the community, but it's an epidemic in terms of the brutalization and marginalizations of trans and queer people of color.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get back to Desiree. There's a couple of things I want to ask you, and I know our time with you is limited, so I really wanted to get to them. And Sarah and Connie, if you want to chime in and add anything to what she says or your own perspective, now is totally the time to do it. But one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is how do you use your personal story and storytelling in general to reach out to and connect with and evangelize for your mission. And you have two groups really that you're working with, if I understand correctly. You have the actual girls and young women that you're trying to empower, and you have organizations and institutions that you're trying to move down a path to make your mission come to a reality. So do you use your personal story to relate to these two groups, and how do you find, is it different? Do you talk to them differently? How do you leverage what has happened to you and what you know from your own self to make other people see your vision and want to help you achieve it?
Ooh, Elisa, what a loaded question.
It's a large question.
But staying true to myself and genuine, I'm going to be very transparent. It is a very delicate line to balance, right? As I move from being safe and speaking in a safe space with my community and those that I connect with, and then also putting on the professional face and speaking at the table where initially I wasn't supposed to be at, right? Mm-hmm. Those tables that weren't meant for folks like us. So it's really a struggle, but also being mindful and aware of the social context of the settings that I'm entering, which I know comes with the privilege of the education that I attained later on in life. But I think ways that I use storytelling to mobilize others is acknowledging and centering the most impacted. That's the key. Beginning to shift the narratives that lived experience is an expertise and more importantly, honoring it as such, making sure that their expertise leads to specific work towards systemic change, and while doing so, compensate accordingly, right? Compensate like we pay other acknowledged experts in the work. Take out a few birds with one stone at the same time, right? Make legitimate, impactful change to the system while also shifting financial access and mobility.
That, you know, you make me think of, to digress just a little, you make me think of an experience that just happened. A longtime friend of mine who runs a multicultural agency in New York called to see if I would be part of like a little think tanky session with a major brand that's having some issues around their branding and knows they need to change it because it's just not fit for 2020 and wants to bring in a small group of people to give them advice. And it's not a huge job. You know, I'm going to be on a Zoom with them for 90 minutes or whatever. How much it paid? Well, they anyway, this cone of silence, it's just us, right? So she said that they thought it would be more authentic if they didn't pay people and that they would make a donation to a charity. And this is a good friend. I may work with her in the future. I was ready to do that, you know, but I said to her, I think it's a little weird to say it's more authentic to ask for the perspective from people from underrepresented groups, which you need to be working with because that's why you're in this position, and then to not want to compensate them for the thinking and advice and expertise they're going to bring you. I know it's not you, but that's a little weird to me, but okay, you know, I would do anything for you. And so let's do it. And I was excited actually about the opportunity to have some money to donate to local groups. Anyway, they got back to me this week and said, okay, well now they are going to pay. They're going to both do a donation and pay. And I was like, all right, then. I can't have been the only person I don't in any way imagine that I'm the only person that said that they asked. But if you don't ask, if you don't speak up and ask for your value and your worth, you know, you're definitely, no one's out there just handing it out. So I so appreciate that comment. And at the same time, during our prep call, you talked a little bit about this concept of imposter syndrome, and that, you know, like you said, you're going and sitting at tables that you don't feel like you were ever invited originally to be at. So how have you evolved your own, the way that you think about yourself, talk to yourself, encourage yourself? What is your actual mechanism and method for being at that table anyway, and asking for what's right, asking for your value, and staying focused on your mission? What do you do to make that happen? Because I think you're surely not the only person amongst us who has this same struggle.
Right. I think for me, or I know for me, a critical point that really shifted my perspective when I started to step in my power was acknowledging the impact and the harm that this notion that poor people, specifically poor women of color, should be grateful or lucky that they even have this job. Right. So it keeps us silent. It keeps us in this like very limited mindset of not to make waves and just be grateful for what we have and take what we're given. And I think in my process of learning and really deconstructing and dismantling the mindset that I had internalized growing up, where I had internalized myself and really believed all these negative stigmas of shame that came along with being a young mom, with being poor, with navigating the welfare system and how the criminal justice system impacted my own life and the life of my loved ones. We internalized those and really believed that we were individually at fault for that, and not acknowledging how the system and society as a whole really contributed to that. So it was a process of steps, and really there was like taking down one brick at a time in that wall, right? But really flipping and turning around and looking at how my lived experience, aside from my academia, I really know acknowledging my own experience and seeing that as an expertise. And one of the things that I learned in academia, which again, I agree with a lot of the narrative that Dr. Connie Woon shares, is how hostile that environment was. I took on Chicano studies because I wanted to learn more about myself and understand, right? But for me personally, I remember as I started reading and doing research in Latinx, Chicana girls like me growing up, all the research was done. Yes, it may have been by other brown women, but not from the specific poor communities that I was a part of growing up. So I knew that even though I didn't have all this academic privilege, that I knew more than the people that were writing about me, than the people that were creating programs to support the girls like me, right? And regardless of their intention, the impact has not been beneficial. So I think really acknowledging and shifting the way we see ourselves, and then holding systems accountable for the way that they see the community as well.
Oh, thank you. That there's a lot there, but your what you're talking about in a way that few other people outside can, and therefore yours is the voice that needs to be heard, right? Elevating the voices of the people who have the most relevant lived experience is sort of, to me, a basic tool of trying to make change or progress. So when Desiree is talking, Connie, I was just going to say, when Desiree is talking about academia and talking about all of that, and I know you have a lot of thoughts there. So what does that bring up for you, and of dealing with the same issues?
So, Des and I have worked together before, and our organizations work together, and I have been a longtime fan of the Young Women's Freedom Center. I think what's really important is not only our lived experience, but our political analysis of our lived experience. Because what makes Desiree and some of the folks that we have all been working with for a number of years is our analysis of what's going on, right? So Desiree has consistently said systemic analysis, systemic accountability. We have a systemic analysis of what's going on. When I talk about like violence against Asian and Pacific Islanders, self-identified women and girls, I don't just talk about the interpersonal. I make it a point to say it's a result of systemic violence. It's a result of colonial violence. We put it under an umbrella, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
super important, because while I know I value myself for my lived experiences, because they have been a whole lot, I do want to say that it's my learned analysis of my experience, right? So I think through, going back to your first question, what was your life like so that it got to this point? As a first generation Vietnamese, girl born in Oakland and raised throughout the Bay Area, I didn't have a racial literacy to explain why we were on food stamps and other people were not. I didn't understand why, I was an inter-district transfer whose family lived in Oakland, but I went to school in Union City and I had to hide where I lived. I didn't understand that literacy, right? And so where I did find the literacy was studying Black liberation, was studying, Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, and then joining forces with other Indigenous and like Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. I learned at a very young age to team up with communities of color, not to see myself as exceptional, but to look at the interconnectedness and to be very accountable to my communities and my neighbors. Right. So I, at AAPI Women Lead, one of the things that we talk about all the time is we are fighting for the end of violence against our communities, but we do it always in solidarity to dismantle anti-indigeneity, to dismantle anti-Blackness. We always do it in solidarity, right? That has been my lived experience growing up with all communities of color. And it also became a part of my experience going into college, right? I went to SF State, first generation, had no clue. I decided my college literally based on eeny, meeny, miny, mo in the Career Center. Literally. And San Francisco State won. Right? Fortunately for me, I joined forces with at the time, we were the third world, we mimicked the 60s. So we called ourselves, the Coalition to Defy 209, which was the affirmative action bill at the time, the anti-affirmative action bill at the time. We joined forces with all the students of color, organizations on the campus. That has been my lived experience. It has always been with other communities of color, always, right? And I also say that because when I was doing this organizing in the 90s, I went in and I started working in San Quentin State Prison. I started learning about, like, you know, incarceration, because my family members were also incarcerated. And I was trying to figure out, again, what was the racial literacy? So I ended up getting in touch with this woman named Yuri Kochiyama. I don't know if folks know who she is, but she was a good friend of Malcolm X's. In the East Coast, she was, you know, super supportive of the Young Lords. Again, Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army. I reached out to her and she said, come to Harlem and I'll put you up and we'll talk about what's going on with incarceration. And it was also there that she said to me, you need to make sure that we always work together and that you also make sure to help free Asian American prisoners. That has been kind of the experience. And then I also want to, you know, make sure that people know that while I have a PhD from UC Berkeley, right, it was also the lived experience of the violence there informs my analysis. It was a violent experience. And I also want to just kind of drop that I'm a former sex worker. Being in academia, the violence that I experienced there, being a sex worker, the violence I experienced there pales in comparison to what happened at UC Berkeley. Pales. I say that because that narrative isn't brought forth. And that experience of having two forms of, like, violence that I experienced helped me to form AA Peer Women Lead. Because I was like, I left academia because of the violence. And I was like, let me go help out my communities, because this institution and academia does more violence to my people than anything that happens on the streets. I will testify that.
Yeah. You each are saying things that just so remind me of things that are happening right now. I have this friend who just started an African American Studies graduate program back east, and she's maybe a little younger than me, probably in her 40s, and she's had a very, very rich, successful, wonderful, rich not in money but robust, like, she's a thinker and a writer and a creator and all of these things. And she just started, and she posted. She sent, like, a message out to her private group about one of her professors. She's queer, and one of her professors making what were clearly textbook homophobic comments. And when my friend tried to call her on it, basically tried to use the whole, you know, there shouldn't be cancel culture on college campuses, and she should be able to, you know, say what, even if people disagree, she should be able to say things. And this is a tenured, also woman of color, another woman of color, tenured professor. And my friend is completely stuck between, you know, can she do anything about that? Or is she going to have to sit and have this, know that one of her professors who has power over her in her department feels this way about an aspect of her identity? And it was shocking to me, which shows that I'm naive and shows I didn't go very far in academia because I didn't like school, right? So, but yeah, I was utterly shocked. This person is clearly, you know, an intellectual and an accomplished person, and they felt perfectly comfortable saying this out loud in front of the class, right? It was a crazy story, and you just totally reminded me of that as an example of just that. To me, seems like an extremely violent act of that professor. So yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. And thank you so much for sort of bringing out the fact that lived experience is great, and it doesn't mean it's all just from the gut and intuitive and you know, you just, although sometimes we do just know things because of our lived experience, but I would never want to take away from what you all have learned by intentional study and action. And I think for the audience who's watching, I think the thing that I think is really important is that each of these wonderful, impressive speakers started from a place of leveraging the lived experience, then to go on and see what they could do about it, and then began to learn the ways and means and tools and equipment they needed, basically from a metaphorical sense, to go make a difference. And that is what I really hope that everyone who's watching can start to understand about themselves, where they can go, where they can take it if they feel very much that there is justice that needs to be done. And your point about joining with others is so important, especially, oh, bye Desiree, she was awesome. Especially if you are moved by the experience and the need for justice from a community of which you are not a part. Look for who you can join, because I guarantee you folks from that community have had their feet on those streets for a long, long time. They've been trying to cry out for a long, long time. You do not need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. You do not need to come in and be a savior. You can find the folks who have been working right on the ground and support their work and elevate their work. And so for any issue that you all out there listening feel that level of passion about, go figure out who also feels that level of passion and how you can help their work, I suppose. But Sarah, I wanted to turn to you now and say, what is your own method of sort of getting yourself at those tables? Do you feel this, do you relate to this concept of imposter syndrome? And if so, how do you push it aside, or how do you move through it, or how do you use it? Maybe you use it and get towards mobilizing and motivating other people around your mission.
Yeah, I think that's a great question around imposter syndrome, because it's something that I know it's like new terminology, right? And when I think imposter syndrome, the times where I felt like I may have been an imposter would be in women's spaces. And this is me before becoming an activist and an advocate, and really just trying to explore different ways where I could network with different kind of folks. And the reason why I felt that imposter syndrome is when I went to these spaces, and this is me like, fresh and involved and seeing where I could find community. I didn't feel included in the sense that every time I went up to people and just did my little spiel, I just felt that conversations were rushed. But in those spaces, I also made it a point to be very intentional with who I was planning to meet. So I know with networking events at these spaces, it's not necessarily the amount of people that you meet. It's not an amount of business cards that you hand out. It's never that. It's making those one or two quality connections. And from that, and this is something that I was learning from mentors over time, just being able to find one or two people that could help elevate you, get something of worth, of something that, like, even if it's the organizers or even if it was with the main speakers, just making that connection and seeing how you can network from there. I feel that the trans community, and this goes back to what Desiree was saying about people should be so lucky to have a job. People should be so lucky to be invited to spaces. People should be so lucky. And it's not a matter of luck. It's not a matter of privilege. It's a matter of respect. And trans people, queer people, non-binary people, they not only deserve your respect, but they demand your respect. And this is where I feel that the trans community overall, like, I feel for a lot of trans folks I know, is that when they identify as trans or when they come out as queer or even LGBTQ, they're left with the responsibility, the burden, if you will, of being able to educate everybody. And as much as storytelling is key in building empathy and building trust and learning about the community, trans people do not owe you that their story until they're ready, because trans people are still marginalized in a way that's more than any other group of people, specifically trans and non-binary people of color. This year alone, we're accelerating at the victimization and brutalizations of trans lives greater than last year. And granted that we are totally in a shelter-in-place year, where it is a privilege to be able to shelter in place, where survival sex work as a means for just providing for yourself, that does not fall under shelter in place. And this is where the decriminalization of sex work needs to happen. In mobilizing and telling my story, again, going back to my mission in just getting trans visibility out there, I personally feel, and this is through my own lived experience is that if I'm able to get it in front of as many mics as I can, as many virtual settings like this as I can, to tell a little bit about my story, talk about some of the work I do, it builds that little sense of empathy. And I'm making an effort to say yes to a lot of things. And I think you folks are bringing up, well, like there's a lot of ways where we could play this, where we want to empower trans people to talk about their stories, yet we do not compensate them for their time, for their efforts, specifically trans women of color, right? And again, when we go back to folks that might live in privilege, right? Or folks that just don't want to share their story or are just not ready, when we impose that burden on them, then we don't get that rich story, right? Whereas there are so many people ready, willing, and able to tell you how to fix the world. This year, the Trans Liberation Rally in New York drew 15,000 people. 15,000, the biggest trans rally I ever seen. And one of the things that I love to share at my rallies and the rallies I hold here locally is this rally cry where it goes, I believe in Black trans power. And I just feel that when you empower the most marginalized communities, you will get the solutions needed to build a socially just, equitable society where everybody can learn from each other. So trans people, they deserve your respect. And it's not up to trans people, non-binary people, people of color, to educate. It's really up to yourself. And you need to move beyond this idea of allyship. It's not about allyship anymore. It's about being an accomplice. And it's in the trans community, we call this stealth, right? Like going under the radar. But we don't need allyship anymore. We need change agents. I need you to be an agent in any space and speak up for the trans community.
Thank you for bringing up that point about the educating of others, because I think that's a dynamic. While I myself just earlier said, go find groups that are led by the people who are most affected and support them and elevate them, but don't necessarily turn to them to explain every little thing about why they're doing what they do. There's this acronym GIYF, Google is your friend. This is like, you take the issue of defund the police, which I actually want to talk about for a little bit. And I've had people push back on me and saying, oh, we should pick a better word. We should pick a more acceptable word. And I'm like, look, I didn't know what defund the police meant 3 months ago either. And I Googled it. And in 5 minutes, I got it. And I was like, oh, it's provocative. It's strong. It says something very specific. It gets people talking. It's now part of the national conversation. I said, I'm not really willing to say we should try and find some nicer word. Let's just go with that. People have been working on this. And so Google is your friend. And also there are actually organizations like Showing Up for Racial Justice is one I can think of, where it's led by white people for white people, basically. So, and I think of a really good analogy, I think, is that I saw this diagram once of concentric circles, where the person in the center, this is totally different from a social justice movement analogy. It's the person in the center is very ill. And so the circle right around them is the people who are caring for that person. And then the circle around them are the people who aren't necessarily caring right for that person, but very closely related. And the circles go out. And the advice was, wherever you are in the circle, only share how upset you are and how sad you are and how mad you are to people further outside the circle. Don't burden the people further inside the circle. Instead, ask them what they need or give them what they need. Just give them things, and sort of, so that you're not burdening more the people who are already more burdened than you. And I think about that diagram, and I think that very much could apply to how you go about educating yourself and activating yourself, which is to, if you need to ask really elementary questions, like first Google it and then find some other people are pretty active, and don't necessarily go to the trans person and say, please explain why support trans people. And so I think that's such a great point. We can do both things. We can support the groups led by the people most affected, and we could go educate ourselves in ways that don't burden the people most affected. And I think that's really what I would recommend if you're looking to really show up for other people, show up for other communities of which you are not maybe directly a part. So thank you for sharing that. Connie, I was going to go to you also on this question of how you, have you experienced what is called imposter syndrome? And sometimes I feel this is becoming a very gendered, like imposter syndrome is one more thing women need to fix about themselves if they want to be successful. And by the way, I know lots of men who have it as well, but how you kind of have approached that yourself and therefore feel you're most powerful and in the right place.
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question, and I love Sarah's answer as well. One of the things that you all just talked about before I get to that answer, I think a lot about accountability, right? So to the point about, it's not our job to educate you. It's not trans folks to educate you. It is everyone's responsibility to be accountable to one another. So your job is not to learn about the plight of somebody else. Your job is to learn about how you're going to be accountable to everyone that you are not, that you have privileges in respect to, right? So I think about that even, today in today's forum, I absolutely forgot to check in about our accessibility. Did we have, ASL interpreters? Did we have captioners? Because our disability, in terms of disability justice, we didn't check in to see if our disabled communities who are, hearing impaired or have different needs, if we were accountable to them, right? So I say that because it's not anyone's job to say to me, I need this. It's my job to say, what do you need, right? And how can I support you? And so I just wanted to kind of offer that to the most previous points. And then in terms of like the question of, the imposter syndrome. I have imposter syndrome depending upon the context.
Okay.
And that matters, I think, because I remember when I got my letter of acceptance from Cal in the PhD program. And I remember like once I opened it, I crouched down onto the ground and I literally was like, do they have the wrong Connie one? Right? And my partner at the time was like, if they do, it's too late. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to take that. But what I realized through the, 6.5 years in the graduate program and then the many years in academia, extensively, I felt like an imposter because that place was a kind of white, heteronormative, masculine, misogynist, patriarchal space. Of course I'm going to be an imposter in that space. I'm here to make interventions in it, right? I felt like an imposter because the value system, they weren't mine.
Right.
So I had to readjust that from feeling like an outsider, as if being an outsider was a problem, right? So I've had to I went through so many years of like feeling so sad in these spaces because I was well-published, tons of awards, but just not feeling aligned with the space and the culture. And as I've left it, I've come back home to other sets of communities that are so much more familiar to me, right? Where our knowledge systems and our values are aligned. And I can flex, I can talk to anybody on the street, like anybody, and code switch, and I feel at home and at ease in these spaces. I don't feel like an imposter, right? And I've been in multiple spaces. I feel at home in these spaces because they align with me. Right? And so I want us to think through why we would feel like imposters. And then I'll say it again, being an outsider is something I'm going to be okay with. And then I get to decide whether or not I'm going to continue to play along with you all. Right? And so towards the end of my, time in academia, I decided, guess what? I'm too valuable. Everything I bring is too valuable to be placed for you all here at limited pay. And so I decided, you're not compensating me, I'll just go outside and I'll just go be with my people with the same skill sets and more.
I would love to reframe imposter syndrome, especially as I see it becoming so gendered out in sort of mainstream ways that is referred to. And I think when you talk about your feeling at Cal, to me, I would call that interloper syndrome. You're an interloper, but that to me conveys a sense of radicalism and of making change and of maybe you're going to interfere with the sort of status quo. And then when I think about the other kind of imposter syndrome that we've talked about, which is that, you know, am I ready? Do I know enough? Should I really be telling other people? I have a lot to learn still. I mean, we all have a lot to learn always. I actually wrote a post about this a few months back about how what people call, at least the first part of imposter syndrome, is humility syndrome, where we're like, you know what, I'm open, I have to learn. And what if more, let's just be frank, what if more white guys had it? You know, when I come from the world of Silicon Valley, so I was thinking of like entrepreneurs and VC and like this whole world where it is so white male dominated. And I'm like, you know, I wish Mark Zuckerberg had had more humility syndrome and thought he doesn't know everything that women are going to experience on his platform, that LGBTQ people are going to experience on his platform, and maybe he should listen to some. And I just call him out, but it could be any of those folks who created any of those platforms, which are basically being used to propagate hate, harass, destroy our democracy, you know, no big whoop. And, you know, maybe a little more humility syndrome would have been a useful thing and a valuable thing in the beginning. So I one of the things I think about is like, can we get rid of this term? Because I think it's really conveying something. When people are using it, to me, they're really talking about something else and trying to kind of pathologize it as a lady problem, that we're not confident enough. And if we just asked for more money, we would get it, you know, stuff like that. So thank you for those thoughts. Sarah, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of abolish, if you want to abolish anything, abolish imposter syndrome. Because when you abolish imposter syndrome, and believe you me, imposter syndrome is easily avoidable if you create and you're mindful of the spaces that you're creating, the workplace that you're creating, the community that you're creating. If anyone feels as an imposter in that space, then you got work to do. In terms of bringing in more intersectional voices, in terms of making sure spaces are accessible, making sure that everyone feels valued within that space. If anyone feels like an imposter in any kind of space, then just like that's where the work needs to happen, right? I also have this thing with abolish, and I like how you brought up abolish as a very charged word, right? Defund, abolish. If there's anything, if you want to take baby steps in thinking about abolish, how about abolishing anti-trans ideology, right? How about abolishing anti-queer ideology? How about abolishing misogyny? Like those are just foundational things that if we were to think about ways where we could empower rather than demean, then we could actually create a better world. And this is where I go back to like education, allyship, move up and level up to being a change agent. It's the work of the people. And I always say that, like, you know, like I said before that, like, I didn't want to come off saying like, don't count on me trying to teach you allyship. It's just like, no. I've been more than happy to be able to do that. That's kind of like my job, and that's my life's work. And this is where like spaces like this exist, where folks, the 52 participants that I see right over here, and the millions maybe that are going to see this after, right?
Definitely millions.
They'll have the opportunity to be able to network with folks like us that are doing that work, that could advise on these things.
Yeah, but your point is totally valid that you've signed up to do that work by leading organizations that are trying to evangelize for new outcomes. You've signed up. The average person they meet who happens to have an identity that they don't share and don't understand has not signed up for that work. And I think that's like the difference is some people do sign up for that, you know, all the time, and great, you know, if you want to learn, take advantage of that, but not the average person that you meet who you're curious about. I see there are questions kind of stacking up in the Q&A section, and I haven't looked at them, so I don't know what they are. Protima, are there any questions from the audience that you want to share with us?
Yes. Oh, thank you. I was, in fact, going to say that it's incredible and powerful how many questions there are. But one thing that I'm hoping before you move on is to I'm going to parse the questions together on defunding the police, as well as the questions around protecting and uplifting trans, cis women of color, right? And the narrative that Dr. Won began with the poverty and connection to incarceration and criminalization, because um, there is increased criminalization of minorities, natives, Black, Hispanic, Asian. And it turns out that the criminalization is directed towards those who are living in poverty. So if the panelists can, it would be great. I promise you there are 75,000 questions. I'm culminating them into this one big giant umbrella, because we do have an embarrassment of riches and talent on our panel right now. The talent that we have on the panel can share their thoughts would be great.
Well, let's start with you, Connie, about the decriminalization, because I know that's part of your organization's, mission. And like at a very simple, starting with this concept of defund the police, is that a movement that your organization supports?
So our organization supports the abolition of prisons and policing, all forms of policing, right? So we're not, and defunding the police is only a strategy to abolish these systems. And we understand that these systems are, they help to usher in sets of ideologies and practices, right? So a lot of abolitionists, which I personally identify as, we think about like prisons and incarceration, policing and surveillance as fundamentally anti-Black and fundamentally anti-Indigenous and fundamentally a form of gender violence, right? So you think through who gets policed the most, what neighborhoods are policed the most, who gets convicted, who gets charged, and who gets held in captivity. It is not coincidental that the folks who are kind of survivors of these forms of surveillance and policing and punishment are predominantly Black, Latinx, Indigenous, gender nonconforming, women who are, many of them are survivors, right? These are the bodies that are policed and punished. When you think about that, you end up thinking about what does the society prioritize, right? Because who doesn't get policed, and that doesn't mean I'm interested in paying attention to surveilling these people in the same way, but the people who don't get policed or punished, not kind of incidentally, are, Trump's administration, for instance, there's been a new accusation of sexual violence that came out today.
Yeah.
I don't see the hyper surveillance happening there. When you think through of, just the other day, and I'll say it colloquially, a couple of days ago, I go outside and the sky is, all of us experienced a red-orange sky. And I was like, I know I didn't do that. So I'm like, oh, the corporations. Oh, the fact that we have not taken care of our environment, right? Which federal agencies, or where's the funding to take care of our land, which is Indigenous land? Are they are punished for the fact that most of us can't breathe right now? Right? But who does get punished and policed? I think through of what's happening in San Leandro, the case around Stephen Taylor, the young man who was killed by police at Walmart for, he was in a mental health crisis and he had maybe it was a toy, something that he had, shot and killed. And I'm like, okay, but hundreds of thousands of us can't breathe right now because of all these white collar, quote unquote, crimes. I don't see anybody else getting punished except for the ones who are survivors of it. So I say that because what abolitionists think about and what we prioritize is a systemic analysis and the conditions by which prisons are even operating as a part of. We know these institutions are anti-Black, anti-poor, pro-gender binaries, right? So we know that's ushering in certain value systems. Meanwhile, there are other people who are and entities and institutions that are running free to cause harm, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's important for us to think about. Abolition, when people are talking about defunding the police, that's only part and parcel of what we're asking for. We're asking for a resetting of all the conditions and all of the resources coming back to the communities who have been survivors of so much more violence than people can even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the way that is a great way that I will start talking about it, which is defund the police is a strategy in a larger goal. I don't know if this is if you're a fan of this work. I always recommend to people, I know a lot of people watch the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay about unequal outcomes in the prison system, in the law part of Law and Order, in the legal system and prison system, which I think is great and is true and should watch it. But what I thought it was missing that the book New Jim Crow outlines is exactly what you're talking about the differences in where they police, who they police, how they police. Because I know a lot of people, I mean, I hear people who basically say that kind of thing. If you don't want to get into the system, just be good. You know, don't do crimes, just comply, just do all these things. And when it becomes clear, when you look at the actual data around who police target, so I think the data shows that white people and Black people, they all use drugs at about the same level, the same percentage. But what neighborhoods do they go to find the people to arrest for drug crimes? They're not going to the basements of white people in suburbia. They're going to other neighborhoods. And to me, that really cracks open this kind of resistance I feel like a lot of people I have spoken to have to understanding this whole, A to Z spectrum of institutionalized difference in approaches on law and order, when it comes to communities of color and particularly low income communities, the whole criminalizing poverty, which, by the way, is exactly what's happening in Florida, right? The voters vote by 2/3 to give felons who have done their time their right to vote. And they right away turn around and pass a law that they can't do that unless they pay their fees, which is basically criminalizing poverty. Bail is basically criminalizing and institutionalizing poverty. And so there's like funds being raised to try and pay all these folks' fees so they can vote in this next election. But that's just like that's like putting your thumb in a hole in a, the kid. And I'm thinking of some story where he puts his hand on the hole in the dike, but he's not going to save Holland or whatever that kid's story is that I'm vaguely remembering. So I think there's just there's so many very mainstream resources out there now for, if you, like I said, Google it and you will find very mainstream resources that can really explain this whole A to Z problem that we have in the system and why it requires a pretty drastic change to get, if you care about equity and justice, right? So anyway, thank you for outlining that.
Just really quickly, I also want to, I hate being on webinars because I don't get to see the audience's faces or their responses, right? Or the attendees. But I also want us to think about how the ways in which the criminal justice system writ large and state agencies have extracted resources from communities, right? When you think about, when you're extracting people as resources from communities, you're extracting relationships from communities as a resource, right? And we are also monopolizing what constitutes community, fairness, justice, freedom, accountability, right? So I think through, my own personal experience as the survivor, and even more recently in my experiences, it's so important for me to have had a community. When I was experiencing some type of violence, I turned to my community to respond. Right? So I think through the work of Mariam Kaba, who is a good friend and mentor of mine, a woman named Mia, a friend named Mia Mingus, Mimi Kim, all of these community members have highlighted community accountability as responses to harms, right? And also to be violence prevention. Community as violence prevention, right? Because going back to my personal narrative, someone that I cared about shows up at my house at 3 a.m, scaring the heck out of me, right? In the middle of a crisis that we were experiencing. And what I did the next day was I called my friends and I said, look, I'm not going to criminalize and I'm not going to slander this person. But if I call you tomorrow at 12 a.m. or 11 p.m., whatever odd number time I call you, I need you to show up at my house immediately. And they were all on deck. And then soon after, we had conversations with this person to figure out like all the harms that were being done. And all that person has said for this entire year has been, or actually now it's been 6 months, I'm really sorry. And that has been validating enough to me, right? And I don't take that lightly. And it's not some, light, fluffy thing. I happen to train Muay Thai, so I do believe in like self-defense and all these things. I'm saying to hear someone say, I'm sorry for the harm I caused is actually very, very important.
Oh, that's so interesting. I have a friend who posted that he apologized to someone he had harmed. He posted this on his Facebook to his friends, and he didn't know if she would ever forgive him or ever. And I said that, no, she may not, and it's not your business. Like you're not entitled to it. I can only say from my own lived experience that an apology would have meant something. I can't tell you exactly what it would have meant or how much it would have meant, but it would have meant something more than denial and non-apology. Like, so I totally.
But there's also an infrastructure in place.
Like you can't. Sorry?
No, I'm saying.
What was that?
There's an apology. And then also, Keith also talked about like, I need to talk to other men about the harms, right? So that's important. So there's a step around, changing
Ownership.
There's ownership, and there's a desire to be accountable. And then there's also, for me, an infrastructure in place. Like I know who to call if somebody tries to harm me. Yeah. So I just want to share that piece, and thank you all for.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how much in some communities they're not going to call the police as a first, whereas in other communities they'll be like 911 first thing. In some communities that's not what they're going to do because it's not worth the risk.
Yeah.
And imagine that if that's not you. Like imagine that if you didn't feel you could call 911 because that outcome would be worse than what you're going through. Sarah, what were you going to add?
Yeah, in terms of defining the police, I think what people need to do in their allyship or accomplice journey is really just interrogate their own safety and just ask yourself the question, what makes you feel safe? What makes you feel safe within the communities that you serve? What makes you feel space or safe in the spaces you occupy? Because I could tell you from my own personal lived experience that, and it seems like a lot of people on this panel and people I've met over time, what keeps us safe is different. It differentiates from a person to person, right?
Yeah.
For me and I'm not going to speak on behalf of the entire trans community, but from a lot of community members I know, even myself, my first inclination is not to call the police because you will feel harassment. I would feel harassment, discrimination, or something, some kind of like implicit bias that's going to be put against me. And that's putting me in double danger, right?
Yeah.
So who do I call? Like, how could I keep us safe? And this is where I feel that we keep us safe. Community keeps us safe. Building strength and finding ways, profound ways to network with one another and leverage each other's skills from the communities that we serve. So believe you me, after this, Dr. Wan, I'm connecting with you to see what we could do with Silicon Valley Pride. And again, this is weird because Silicon Valley Pride is a celebration organization, but the reason why they brought me on is really just like celebration for who? If it doesn't celebrate every single identity within the LGBTQI plus spectrum, then it's not a celebration for all of us. And this is where we need to really take inventory, accountability, and really just like, we are at a perfect time right now during shelter in place to slow down, right? Self-reflect. You have time to educate yourself over the weekend. Yet if you choose not to take those proper steps, then how is we as a society going to improve? Well, for folks that don't want to take that time, I'm just going to push it over to police. Yeah, but that's not your lived experience, right? Or that's your lived experience, and that's how you're going to get that access. But for people that are within the marginalized communities, like for them to feel safe is different because I feel the most safe at Black Lives Matter protests. I feel the most safe at rallies. I feel the most safe when I'm with my queer community. And I'm just not talking about like, just, gay bars. I'm talking about the full intersectional community where every voice is represented. The more diverse, the more safe I feel.
That is a word. Sarah Fernando, Dr. Connie One, I want to thank you for both sharing both your lived experience and a phrase I will add to how I speak with people moving forward, your learned analysis, because I love that, your lived experience and your learned analysis. I want to thank you both for sharing that with everyone who is on this webinar, because I think even in these stories we're talking about there, all the breadcrumbs were laid for you, meaning y'all who are watching, to figure out how you want to carry forward and mobilize and support other people who are mobilizing. I feel like you laid, and Desiree, who's no longer here, you laid a path that people could follow to figuring out how they want to mobilize, what they want to mobilize about, and going out and doing it. And the whole point of these three panels that we did, for those of you who've seen all three, first of all, thank you. But the first, we looked at some historical context of the history of the 19th Amendment and behind and what it took to get there, which was which was years, which was decades. And then in the second, we looked at, okay, do you want to run for office? Do you want to get appointed to commissions? Do you want to try and work from within the system? And today we're talking about, do you want to mobilize within and without the system and, and try to make a real difference? There are many different ways. We don't all have to follow the same path, but we've heard a lot to support us on many different paths today. So I just feel really, really grateful to have spoken with you both today. And Protima, I will toss it over to you.
Oh, thank you. I have never had a harder act to follow. I feel blessed and lucky that I've been able, and I'm sorry my video is not visible, we'll get that going. I also want to say, as I make my closing remarks, and yay, Sharon, I see you. My video is not working, but thank you, Sharon. As Sharon and I are chatting, each one of you who's with us still is going to get the option to become a panelist so we can see you all. A reminder of what Dr. One was saying, we want to be in community. We're going to try to welcome you. And if you're not comfortable, because this is being recorded and it's streamed live on Facebook, choose not to accept invitation to become a panelist. But I want to say, how powerful, Sharon, how powerful has this been? How meaningful and how, to me, change making. Because as change agents, I want to start to use that word change agents. I use it, but now I'm intentionally going to use it because as change agents, we're here to demonstrate collective power. As you see the screen filling up, this is our collective power, right? Sharon. You're on mute.
Well, thank you. I rarely am speechless. And thank you, Elisa and Connie and Desiree and Sarah. What I would like to ask everybody who watch this is, what are you going to tell somebody this afternoon or tomorrow? What is your takeaway from this marvelous, wonderful presentation, all three that we have had? And what I've heard, and I thank you greatly, is not to be afraid of our voices. We honor Selena Solomons, who in 1911 wanted to invite every woman, not just the rich white woman, but every woman to the suffrage table. And you are standing on her shoulders, and you have made her proud. And I want everyone to believe that, and what I've heard you say is that you value your lived experiences and that we don't have to fix ourselves. We are fine the way we are. We have some work to do, but our lived experiences have value. And thank you immensely for that. And I also want to thank Protima and the Office of Women's Policy, who we had great ideas of how to celebrate the 100th anniversary. And then of course the pandemic came in, but it didn't stop us. And so to Pratima and Laura and all of the staff, thank you for creating this venue, this way that we can listen to the stories. And I am so glad that it's being taped, because I have so many notes that I need to go back and listen and write in again. And to the Office of Women's Policy, to my dear friends, thank you. And thank you to our panelists and Elisa. Nobody else could have done such a beautiful, smooth job. I'm so sorry it's over. I'm so sorry, but thank you.
Yes. No, Sharon, it's over, but this is the beginning. I always say this is the beginning. We wanted to end with mobilizing, because mobilizing is where we get our strength. I see all our amazing stakeholders, accomplices, also allies, as I said in the chat. To me, allyship is a verb. It says so on my desk right now. I see Vice Mayor Sunnyvale Nancy Smith. I see Judge Catherine Lucero. The leadership of Judge Lucero is the reason Santa Clara County is working towards getting to zero incarceration of girls and transgender non-conforming youth with the help of Young Women's Freedom Center. I see Corina, our wonderful accomplice. I see my honorable, amazing colleagues, Julie and Quetzal and Kathy. And of course, everybody joined me in thanking and congratulating Laura Kim, who ran with this as soon as everything began to go shelter in place. Laura ran with it. She is demonstrating her 100% amazing capacity, talent, capabilities. But I do want to say that as we close out, you're going to hear from our co-chair of the Women's Equality Leadership Council, Shruti Sri Ravi Shankar. On March 8th, 2018, I was in a room, a really small room at Shri's High School, Notre Dame, and Shri came up to speak. There must have been less than 20 women in that room, and I see this amazingly talented young woman begin to talk to us. And I realized, oh, thank you, Pratima. Your work is done. There are amazing, talented young people who are going to take this and make sure that the future is okay. And suddenly I realized, no, if we don't protect, preserve, and promote what we have, what are we going to hand over to young, talented, amazing people like Shri? And so I ask each one of you, as we close out the day with Shri's words, to remember what Sharon just said, your takeaways. My takeaway, Dr. Wan reminded us of closed captioning. I'm going to ask for our Zoom to be upgraded to add the closed captioning option, because we looked into it and we realized we needed to upgrade. So we will do that. That's my takeaway. Sarah, my takeaway is to stop using the word imposter syndrome and change our narrative. Desiree, my takeaway is to continue pushing our systems to get to zero incarceration. And now I'm going to ask Gora to play Shri's video. Please stay on screen or leave. Join us. Join us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shruti Sri Ravi Shankar, and I'm currently a senior at Notre Dame High School. I want to start off by saying that it is such an honor to be a part of the third and last Soup Salad Suffrage event. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend virtually, but I am sure that you all enjoyed the presence of incredible speakers. And before I get to my prepared remarks, I want to thank both Laura and Pratima for extending an invitation to deliver the closing statement. Much of the work that I have pursued started in Santa Clara County. So to me, this is such a special community, and I couldn't be more grateful for participating in this wonderful event. So I was asked to talk about my journey and why I decided to pursue a path of youth empowerment and active civic engagement. It was because I felt that our political and social systems are skewed. I knew that in order to create a fair and equitable community, we need more youth leaders. We have to reduce the gap at all levels of government, local to national. The issue of exclusion is not just a loss for youth, it is a loss for all of humanity because we lose the new ideas and perspectives that they bring to the table. I remember telling myself this one-size-fits-all approach isn't working, and it won't ever work unless we begin to think beyond race, class, gender, religion, sexuality. So I asked myself, how do we highlight youth issues, including our perspectives and experiences for the betterment of society? When I asked that question, I realized that instead of contemplating or blaming others, it was time to take action and challenge the marginalization head on. That question served as a starting point, which allowed me to work with various advocacy groups, empower myself, take initiatives, and mobilize change. Even if that meant much of my work would be marked by a trifecta of firsts. But enough about me. The reality is, while we have done some incredible work around the community, there are still persisting problems that we need to handle. From drug abuse to homelessness and from student loans to unemployment, the challenges that youth face are high in number. And this requires us to reallocate our resources and join hands intergenerationally .
We're going to get feedback, I promise you. Give us a second. This is the joy.
We have seen so much happening recently, from the West Coast fires to the cases of police violence and racial injustice. And at this moment, we need an incredible level of vitality, energy, and commitment from the youth community to help
pitch in and change the world. Despite our different stages of experience and our different levels of exposure, I am sure we can offer some interesting perspectives. For youth like myself, our power stems from our conviction. We believe we have an obligation to serve and improve our local, national, and global communities. We believe in our democracy. We believe in inclusion. If we are seen, if our stories are heard, it will make a difference. Now think about the March for Our Lives movement. So many students endured extreme violence and trauma, but they were able to transform their pain into a powerful initiative. The power of youth made Florida lawmakers give passage to gun control and school safety bills. Now think about climate change rallies to green light rallies that fight against youth homelessness. All of these movements show that when youth put their mind to do something, they can accomplish what they want. While many of us already know this, we can actively engage ourselves through rallying, petitioning, writing editorials, but one shouldn't forget the key civic duty, and that's voting. When we take the initiative to register, vote, we're not only advocating for causes we believe in, we are also creating a just society. So to all youth, let's continue to utilize the different opportunities available for us to step up and create a positive impact in the community. To all others, let's remember that youth are no longer an invisible force. We have the power to shape our destiny and create a better future. Thank you very much.
I see, how can you follow that now? That's why we wanted to close with this. I want to encourage everybody to look the Office of Women's Policy social media page. We have an event tomorrow at noon with the Executive Postmaster of San Jose, Erin Jones. We're going to be releasing the 19th Amendment Centennial Commemorative Stamp locally here in Santa Clara County. Please join us. It's a half-an-hour press conference, but it's a meeting style, so we'll all get to demonstrate our collective promise to preserve, protect, and promote the right to vote. Our Registrar of Voters will also be speaking, as will the chair of the Women's Equality Leadership Council, who also happens to be the president of the Board of Supervisors for Santa Clara County, Cindy Chavez. And on October 6th at 7 p.m., it's in the evening, along with the Japantown Community Congress, Office of Women's Policy is hosting an event called We Shine, We Vote. We're highlighting the commitment and collaborative power of diverse communities. So I hope you can join us. I thank everybody for being with us on this journey. And as you go forward, remember the work that's done cannot be forgotten. The fight that won us the right to vote, in the words of Sharon Buska, was hard won, not done. And finally, as I close out, let's work to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. The press conference is at noon. Thank you, and thank you.